The iron gates loomed ahead, twisting vines of metal shaped into elegant yet unnatural patterns, like skeletal fingers intertwining in an eternal waltz. Elena adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, her stomach nodding as she stepped forward, her reflection warping in the polished brass plate that read, Blackwood Ballet Academy, perfection or nothing. At 18, she was finally here. She had fought tooth and nail for this scholarship, clawing her way up from the cramped, underfunded dance studios of her small town. Yet as the gates creaked open and she stepped onto the stone path leading to the grand Gothic-style building, something inside her whispered, turn back. The academy was a masterpiece of old-world architecture, its windows stretching impossibly tall, its spires slicing into the overcast sky. A cold wind curled through the courtyard, carrying the scent of lavender and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. She shook off the unease, reminding herself this was her chance to be great, to prove everyone wrong. The moment she entered the marble-floored lobby, her breath caught. Statues of dancers stood in perfect arabesques along the hall, their sculpted, muscles taut, expressions frozen in eerie ecstasy. A group of girls passed by, whispering, their movements so fluid they barely seemed to touch the ground. New girl? One murmured, her eyes flicking to Elena's legs before smirking. Better keep up. Elena ignored the jab and focused on the receptionist, an older woman with thin, papery skin. Elena Vale, she said, pushing forward. Her acceptance letter. The woman's milky blue eyes lingered on her hands before nodding. Your dorm is in the East Wing. Training starts at dawn. No excuses. Elena nodded, gripping the key as she followed the dimly lit corridors. Her footsteps, muffled by thick crimson carpets. The air smelled of wood polish and something faintly rotting beneath it. The dorms were as pristine as the rest of the school, but the moment she stepped inside, she felt watched. Her roommate, Camille, was already stretching by the mirror, her flexibility unnatural. You must be Elena, she said, not turning around. I hope you last longer than the others. The word sent a chill down Elena's spine. The others? Camille finally looked at her, smiling, but her eyes held something unreadable. They left. Something about the way she said it made Elena unsure if left meant by choice. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint echoes of music from somewhere below. Too slow, too haunting to be part of normal training. She told herself it was just nerves, that every prestigious school had its oddities, but as the days passed, she would come to understand. Blackwood was not normal. Elena's muscles ached by the end of the first week, her body pushed to its limits under the grueling regime of Blackwood Ballet Academy. The instructors demanded nothing short of flawlessness. Pointed feet, elongated lines, complete surrender to the craft. But what unsettled her most wasn't the intensity of training. It was the other dancers. Their movements were inhumanly precise, as if their bodies had been molded for ballet alone. Even the newer students, ones she had assumed were just as fresh and unpolished as herself, improved at an impossible rate. On Monday, a girl named Lisette had been struggling to keep her balance in arabesque. By Friday, she was executing fouette turns with an unnatural grace, her extensions unnervingly perfect, her limbs appearing almost different. And yet, there were others who seemed to simply vanish. Elena had noticed an awkward but promising boy Jonah in warm-ups on the first day. By midweek, he was gone. No explanation, no farewell. When she had asked about him, Camille had merely shrugged. He wasn't good enough, she'd said. But the way she said it, so dismissive, so absolute, made Elena uneasy. Then there were the injuries, or rather, the lack of them. Blackwood's training was relentless, demanding a level of physical strain that should have resulted in sprains, fractures, swollen joints. But the students never seemed to stay hurt. Elena had seen a girl, Vivian, take a brutal fall during a grand jeté, the sickening snap of her ankle making even the instructors wince. Yet 2 days later, Vivian was back, her leaps higher than before, her legs longer, her spine more arched, as if the broken bone had been replaced. Elena's stomach twisted at the thought, but she told herself it was just in her head. The pressure of being in such a prestigious academy playing tricks on her. Until one night she saw it with her own eyes. It was past curfew, but Elena couldn't sleep. The soreness in her calves kept her tossing and turning, and the strange melodies that drifted through the air, the same haunting music she had heard on her first night, only added to her restlessness. Deciding a walk might clear her mind, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. The dormitory was eerily silent, the only sound the distant ticking of an antique clock. As she turned a corner, she saw a faint light glowing from beneath a door at the far end of the hall. She knew the layout of the academy well enough to recognize it as one of the instructor's offices, but what caught her attention wasn't the light. It was the whispering. She crept closer, pressing her ear against the cold wood. At first it was just murmurs, but then she caught snatches of conversation, words that sent a chill through her bones. Her femur is perfect. A pause. She doesn't need both. Elena clapped a hand over her mouth to stop her gasp. The voice belonged to Madame Duval, the lead instructor, her tone as clinical as a surgeon discussing an operation. The harvest must be done before dawn. Elena stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. Harvest? She couldn't process what she had just heard. It had to be a misunderstanding, and yet, as she turned to leave, she caught sight of something even worse. The door wasn't fully shut. Through the crack, she could see inside. A girl was lying unconscious on a velvet chaise, her delicate frame draped in the school's signature, white training leotard. Elena recognized her immediately. Margot, a first-year student, one of the quieter ones. But something was wrong. Margot's left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, her shin slightly shorter than before, her foot strangely delicate. Standing over her was Madame Duval, along with Astrid, the school's prima ballerina. In Astrid's hands was something small, pale, glistening under the low light. A bone. Elena's stomach churned as realization crashed into her. They were taking her bones. She staggered away from the door, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Panic clawed at her throat. This couldn't be real. This wasn't possible. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was why Blackwood dancers were so perfect. They weren't just training harder. They were taking, stealing, absorbing. And if Elena wasn't careful, she would be next. Elena barely slept that night. She lay rigid in bed, her breath shallow, heart slamming against her ribs as the horrifying truth of Blackwood Ballet Academy took root in her mind. They were taking bones, swapping them, replacing them. That was why the dancers improved so rapidly. That was why injuries vanished overnight. They weren't healing. They were being rebuilt. Every perfect arabesque, every impossible extension, it wasn't skill alone. It was stolen. She turned onto her side, eyes darting to Camille's bed across the room. Had Camille taken someone's bones? Was she waiting to take Elena's? A sickening thought surfaced. Had she been given someone else's before? The way Camille moved, the way her limbs bent past the limits of human anatomy. Had she always been that way? Or had she been altered? The memory of Madame Duval's voice sliced through her thoughts. The harvest must be done before dawn. Somewhere in the academy right now they were taking Margot apart, and no one would stop them. The next morning, Elena forced herself through class, her mind spinning with questions. Who decided who was taken? Was it based on performance, weakness, or was it something more sinister? Her muscles burned as she moved through the exercises, but she barely felt it. She was too busy watching, analyzing. Which of them had been changed? Astrid, the prima ballerina, was the most obvious. Her movements were beyond human, her limbs longer, her spine more arched, her leaps almost supernatural. But it wasn't just her. Vivienne, who had miraculously recovered from a broken ankle, now seemed even stronger. Lisette, the girl who had struggled with her balance, was now turning with a precision that defied physics. Their bodies were evolving, reshaping, perfecting, but at what cost? Then there were the others, the ones who didn't seem to change, the ones who struggled, stumbled, fell behind, like Jonah, like Margot, and like Elena. A cold weight settled in her stomach as she realized, if you weren't improving, you were disposable. Her gaze flickered to Madame Duval, who was watching her too closely, her icy stare lingering on Elena's legs, her arms, her spine. Evaluating. Measuring. A jolt of panic shot through her. Was she next? She had been accepted on scholarship. Was she already marked as expendable? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had to get out. But escaping Blackwood wasn't simple. The gates were locked at night. The windows of the dorms were barred. There were no phones, no internet, no way to reach the outside world. The academy existed in its own eerie vacuum, isolated in the thick woods that surrounded it. The only way out was through the main doors during approved hours, and no one left unless Blackwood let them. Elena knew if she tried to run, they would stop her. And then they would take her bones. No, she had to be smart. Careful. She had to pretend. If they thought she was improving, maybe they wouldn't notice her. Maybe they would overlook her. So she pushed herself. She danced harder than she ever had before. She forced her limbs into painful extensions, stretched until she thought her muscles would tear. She mimicked Astrid's movements, perfecting every line, every turn. She let the pain mold her, let the terror fuel her. And it worked. At the end of class, Madame Duval approached her, thin lips curling into something that almost resembled a smile. I see you're finally serious about your training, Miss Vale. Elena forced herself to smile back. Yes, madame. Duval tilted her head, eyes gleaming. Good. I was beginning to worry you weren't meant to be here. Elena swallowed, the lump in her throat. That was a warning. A reminder that she had no choice but to succeed, or be taken. But then something happened that shattered her fragile sense of control. That night she was heading back to her dorm when she saw Camille slip into a side corridor, moving with the eerie grace of a shadow. Elena hesitated, then followed, keeping her steps light. Camille moved deeper into the academy, past the grand hall, past the locked rooms Elena had never dared explore. Finally, she stopped at a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. Elena barely breathed as she crept closer. The room was dimly lit by candlelight, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then she saw them. Bones, stacked neatly on polished mahogany shelves, femurs, ribs, spines, some aged, yellowed, others fresh, gleaming white. Elena's stomach turned violently. This wasn't just an academy. It was a collection, and Camille, her roommate, her friend, was standing in the center of it, holding a bone, turning it over in her hands like an artifact. Then, as if sensing Elena's presence, Camille slowly looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something ancient, something hungry. A slow, knowing smile curved Camille's lips. You weren't supposed to see this, she said softly. And then the door slammed shut. Elena's breath hitched as the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her in with the grotesque collection of bones. Her heart pounded so violently she could hear the blood rushing in her ears, louder than the candle flames flickering against the walls. Camille took a step forward, the bone still in her hands, running her fingers along its smooth surface as though she were caressing silk. You shouldn't be here, Elena, she murmured, her voice almost regretful. Almost. The way she held that bone, the way her eyes gleamed in the dim light sent a sickening realization through Elena's gut. Camille had done this before. How many bones had passed through those delicate fingers? How many bodies had been harvested to perfect her lines, her turns, her impossible flexibility? Elena's back pressed against the door as she fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Camille let out a soft sigh. I liked you. You know, she said, taking another step closer. I hoped you'd be smart enough to keep your head down, to survive. But now, she turned the bone over in her hands. Now I don't have a choice. Elena's stomach lurched. You, her voice cracked. You killed them? Camille tilted her head, amusement flickering across her face. Killed? She echoed as if the word itself was absurd. No, Elena, we don't kill, we improve. She gestured to the shelves, the carefully arranged bones. They live on, in us, in me, in Astrid, in every dancer you envy. She took another step. And now you get to be part of something greater. Panic clawed at Elena's throat. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. She had to get out. She whirled around, slamming her fists against the door, ignoring the sting, as her knuckles split against the wood. No one would hear her. No one would come. She was alone, trapped. Camille's voice was closer now, almost at her ear. You have something special, Elena. They've been watching you. Cold terror washed through her. Who? Camille continued, her voice laced with something disturbingly reverent. Madame Duval, Astrid the collector. Elena turned her head slightly, her breath shallow. The collector? Camille smiled. He chooses the best, and he's chosen you. Elena's stomach dropped. She wasn't just going to be harvested. She was going to be given, offered. She spun around, her body coiled with desperation, ready to fight. But Camille was faster. A hand shot out, fingers curling around Elena's wrist like iron. Don't struggle, Camille murmured. It only makes it worse. Elena yanked, but Camille's grip tightened, nails digging into her skin. Something was wrong. Camille's strength, it was inhuman. The bones. They had given her more than just flexibility. They had made her stronger. Elena sucked in a sharp breath and did the only thing she could. She bit Camille's hand, hard enough to taste blood. Camille let out a sharp, startled cry, jerking back just enough for Elena to rip herself free. She didn't hesitate. She ran. She barreled through the room, knocking over a stack of bones, sending them clattering to the floor. Camille cursed, behind her footsteps pounding as she gave chase. Elena didn't dare look back. She tore through the dim corridors, the flickering candlelight casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The academy was a maze at night, the familiar halls twisting into something foreign, something hungry. The cold bit at her skin, her ballet slippers slapping against the marble floors. She had to find a way out. A hiding place. Something. But the academy was built like a prison. Every turn led to another locked door, another hallway stretching endlessly into the dark. There was no way out. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Not just Camille's. More. Many more. A slow, deliberate rhythm, too perfectly in sync to be natural. The others. They were coming. A shudder of horror racked through her body. They knew. They had been waiting. Elena skidded to a stop, her chest rising and falling in sharp, ragged gasps. Ahead of her, at the end of the corridor, shadows shifted. A figure stepped into the candlelight. Astrid. Her long limbs moved with eerie precision, the candlelight catching the unnatural curve of her spine, the too perfect alignment of her legs. Her expression was serene, almost loving. You don't have to be afraid, Elena, she said softly. This is how we become great. Elena took a step back, then another. But Camille's voice came from behind her. There's nowhere to run. Elena turned, her breath hitching. Camille stood there, her hand still bleeding, but she didn't seem to care. She was smiling. Slowly, the other dancers emerged from the shadows, silent, graceful, their eyes gleaming with something ancient, something starved. Elena's back hit the wall. Her pulse thundered in her ears. There were too many. She was trapped. And then finally she saw him. The collector. He stepped forward and the others parted for him. He wasn't like the others, he wasn't thin and graceful, wasn't elegant like the dancers who surrounded him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a mask of polished bone, A shiver ran down Elena's spine as he regarded her with quiet curiosity. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed at her. Elena couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The dancers closed in, their movements slow, deliberate, their fingers reaching, their faces soft with something like devotion. The collector spoke, his voice deep, resonant. "She is ready." "No. No," Elena screamed. Elena's scream echoed through the cold, empty halls of the academy, a desperate primal cry that seemed to hang in the air, reverberating against the stone walls. But it did nothing. No one came. There was no one to save her. No one who would hear her pleas. The dancers were silent now, their eyes glazed over with an unnerving calm. The collector's mask gleamed in the low light, its polished surface reflecting the flickering flames of the nearby candles. His finger, long and bony, still pointed toward her. Elena could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm she couldn't control. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, to do anything but remain in this suffocating room, surrounded by monsters. But her body refused to obey. Fear had her locked in place. "Don't be afraid," the collector's voice rumbled, deep and smooth like the sound of stone grinding against stone. "You're about to become something more." Elena's chest tightened. Her pulse roared in her ears as she shook her head violently. No, she didn't want this. She didn't want to become like them. She had seen the marks on their bodies, the perfect, flawless limbs that moved as if they were made of something other than flesh. And now, they wanted hers. The thought made her stomach churn. Every instinct screamed at her to break free, but she was paralyzed. Not from the terror alone, no, something deeper held her in place, something cold and unfamiliar, something that felt almost like a whisper of an invitation. Astrid took a step forward, her feet making no sound against the floor. "We don't just take what we need," she said softly, her voice melodic, hypnotic. "We give. We share. We perfect." She raised a hand to touch Elena's face, and her skin felt as though it burned where Astrid's fingers grazed it. "We make the weak strong." A wave of nausea washed over Elena. She would be sacrificed. She wasn't going to be part of their perfect dance. She wasn't going to become another piece of the grotesque puzzle they had constructed. But the fear, no, the dread, made her bones feel like they were turning to stone, and every time she thought to move, her limbs felt heavier, slower, as though something was holding her back. The collector stepped forward then, moving in time with the dancers who still watched her, their eyes glazed and far away. She could feel their hunger, their unquenchable thirst for more. And she could feel herself in some twisted way, becoming part of it. "I know you're scared," the collector continued, his voice low and unsettling. "But it's already begun. You can't undo what's been done." "No," Elena whispered, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "I won't let you. I won't." But the words caught in her throat as Astrid reached out to take her wrist, her grip tight, unyielding. Elena's breath caught. The dancer's hand was cold, unnaturally cold, and when she tried to pull away, it felt as if Astrid's fingers were wrapped around her very soul, pulling her down into something she couldn't escape. She gasped, her vision blurring for a moment as the world seemed to spin around her. She tried to scream again, but no sound came. The others began to circle, their movements impossibly fluid, as though they were part of the air itself. They closed in around her, a wall of perfect bodies, their limbs stretching in ways that defied human anatomy. Their movements were too graceful, too fluid, their faces too serene. And the collector? He stood back, watching her with something that looked disturbingly like pride. Astrid pulled Elena's arm up, and she felt her body protest, resisting every pull, every tug. No, she couldn't go with them. Not like this. She couldn't be another one of their empty, perfect shells. But the whispering started again. Faint, distant at first, then louder, insistent. "Let go." The voice sounded like Camille's, sweet and seductive, coaxing her to submit. "It will be easier. Just give in. The thought almost felt like it belonged to Elena, like it was her own voice, pulling her into the web the collector had spun. "Please," Elena choked out, her voice breaking. "Please don't do this to me." Camille's cold eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment Elena saw something in them. A flicker of hesitation. Was it regret? No. Camille only smiled, that predatory, knowing smile. "It's already too late for regrets." Elena tried to fight against it, to fight against them. She pulled and twisted, her body aching with every movement, her muscles protesting. She wanted to scream, to break free, to escape. But she felt their power then, the power that had made them so perfect. They were all too strong, too relentless, too familiar with the sensation of tearing others apart to perfect themselves. She had been fooled by her own envy. She had wanted to be like them, to be admired, to dance like them, with precision, with perfection. She had wanted it too badly. The collector stepped closer, and Elena felt his presence surround her, the air growing thick with tension. She could feel his gaze, cold and unyielding, watching her every move. She could feel the weight of his decision. He didn't have to say anything. Elena knew what was coming. She felt the shift in the air as he reached into his robe, pulling something out. Something long, shining, and sharp. It was a knife. No, not a knife. A bone. Elena gasped as he held the bone in front of her, the sharp edge gleaming under the candlelight. The others were silent now, watching as the collector moved with eerie calm. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to do anything but extend his hand. "No." Elena's voice was barely a whisper, her strength drained by the dance of the otherworldly power they had over her. But the whispering voice was still there, inside her, urging her to submit. "Please don't." But the collector only smiled. It was the last thing she saw before the darkness took her. When Elena awoke, she didn't know where she was. The world around her was a blur, cold and unfamiliar. She could feel the remnants of something, pain, sharp and intense, like her bones had been fractured and twisted in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her limbs felt heavy, too heavy, as though they were made of stone instead of flesh. She could barely move, let alone stand. But there was something worse, something darker than the physical pain. There was an emptiness inside her, a deep, gnawing void. It was as if something had been taken from her. No, not just taken, consumed. She could feel it, in every fiber of her being, the absence of something important, something vital. She tried to call out, but no sound came. Her throat felt raw, as though she hadn't spoken in days. Her chest was tight, and the air around her was heavy, dense, suffocating. But there was something else too. The slightest sound, faint but present like the soft rustling of fabric. She froze, her heart racing as she tried to listen. It was the quiet click of ballet shoes against the floor, soft and measured, like the rhythm of a clock ticking down to something inevitable. She tried to lift her head, but the room around her remained blurry. All she could make out were shadows, figures in the distance. One of them stepped forward. It was Astrid. Her pale face gleamed in the dim light, her eyes a void, empty and cold. Her lips twisted into a smile, but there was no joy in it, no warmth. Only the cold, dead satisfaction of someone who had already claimed their prize. "Elena." Astrid's voice was soft, almost kind, but there was nothing comforting about it. It felt like a trap. "You've woken up. Good. You were beginning to worry us." Elena tried to push herself up, but her body was uncooperative. Every movement felt like a monumental effort, like she was wading through concrete. The pain intensified. She gasped, her chest heaving as her hands shook, trying to lift herself. "No," Elena managed, her voice hoarse. "No. What did you do to me?" Astrid's smile widened. "We did what needed to be done." The words made no sense, but something inside Elena, something deep, already understood. She remembered the bone, the sharp edge of the blade, the overwhelming sense of dread as they closed in, as the dancers began their last fatal choreography. "What did you do?" Elena whispered again, her breath ragged. "You're one of us now," Astrid said simply, her voice soft, like she was telling Elena she had won a prize. "You've been perfected." The word echoed in Elena's mind, but it made her stomach churn. She tried to move again, but her body was too weak, too stiff. Her limbs felt like they didn't belong to her anymore. They had been changed. Astrid stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with something Elena couldn't identify. "You'll understand soon," Astrid whispered. "You'll see. You'll be just like the rest of us." Elena shook her head, struggling against the weight of her own body. No, she refused. She wouldn't join them. She wouldn't become a part of their perfect dance, their grotesque obsession with beauty and power. But as she lay there, helpless and broken, she could feel something inside her stirring. A whisper. A call. The same one that had lured her in. She looked up at Astrid again. Her eyes were no longer empty. No. Now they were alive, gleaming with something terrible and seductive. Elena could feel it now too inside her, the desire to be perfect, to be admired, to dance like they did. To be like them. "No," Elena choked out. But even as the word left her lips, she felt her resolve starting to waver. Something deep inside her wanted to give in, wanted to submit, wanted to accept the invitation. Astrid leaned down, her voice a soft caress. "It's easier this way, Elena. Let it go." The words echoed in Elena's head, spinning in her mind like a twisted lullaby. Her heart began to race again, but now it wasn't from fear. No, it was from the pull, the need to be perfect, to be flawless, to be worthy. The dancers had taken from the weak, and now they wanted her. They wanted to perfect her, to make her one of them. But at the last moment, just as the darkness was about to swallow her whole, a spark of clarity broke through the fog in her mind. Elena could feel it, the truth. They had taken their perfection from others. They had consumed what was weaker, what could be discarded. They weren't perfect, they were empty. The perfection they had achieved had come at the cost of everything they once were. They had given up their humanity for their beauty, for their flawless dance. And now, they wanted to take hers too. No, Elena didn't know where the strength came from, but it surged within her, a flood of energy that broke through the fog of fear and desire. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, and forced herself to stand. Pain shot through her body, but she didn't stop. She didn't falter. She stood taller, her chest heaving as she locked eyes with Astrid. "I'm not like you," Elena said, her voice steady despite the agony coursing through her. "I won't be like you." Astrid's eyes narrowed, her smile fading into something more dangerous. The dancers behind her began to shift, but Elena didn't look away. She could feel the pull of their perfection, but this time it was different. This time she knew it for what it was. Elena clenched her jaw and began to move. Slowly at first, her limbs still sluggish, but with each step, she felt the strength returning to her. The fog lifted. She could hear their whispers, those sweet, enticing promises, but she refused to listen. "I won't let you take me," Elena said with a fierce determination, her voice ringing through the room. "I'll fight." Astrid's eyes flashed, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. "You can't fight what's already been done," she hissed. But Elena didn't listen. She ran, stumbling at first but gaining momentum with each step. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay in their world of perfect bodies and hollow souls. She would escape, even if it cost her everything. And so, with the last of her strength, Elena ran into the unknown, leaving behind the place where perfection had been made, the place where she had almost lost herself. But she was free. and that was enough.